Hi, this is Jeff Carmen with Elite BSC. I hope you're doing well. Hey, this is going to be the second part in our practical advice series on building a healthy, sustainable growth in a janitorial company. I think I mentioned last week that there's a ton of good videos out there talking about how to grow your janitorial company, and I watch a number of them. One of the things that I think some of them fall short on is just kind of that granular, how do you get things done? So for instance, a lot of people talk about making a list, but sometimes we don't go deep enough to say, here's how you develop a list. So we're going to cover some of those things in this particular episode. Two things that we talked about last week is one, we talked about the buyer's journey and how important that is, that we understand the buyer's journey. And we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. And then secondly, we talked about the importance of developing an ideal customer profile. And so I won't talk about that as much during this session, but it will come up. But it's those two things, understanding the buyer's journey and developing an ideal customer profile, would precede these things that I'm going to talk about. And then secondly, or lastly, I guess, is what the things that I'm going to talk about are, and I think I mentioned this in the previous video, are going to be for companies who are getting to the point where they've got cash flow. They're not taking as much business as they can just to kind of survive. This is the things that I'm going to talk about here are for folks who have gotten their business up to a level and are ready to really start becoming more focused in their business growth activities and want to develop something that's more sustainable and long term. And so that's what we'll do here. So let's jump right in. And I want to go back to, this is our business growth process. I showed this last week. It's a six-part or a six-phase approach. This is what we have used for a number of years at France Building Services. And so I won't go over these again. You can watch the video. I'll put a link in the email that I send out to go back to and watch the other ones. But in this particular session, I'm going to talk about, or this episode, I'm going to talk about that first phase or that first step in the process, and that is finding prospects. And right there at the very top, it says using this particular step is using research tools to gather company or organization information and contact information and adding that information into a sales database. So that's what's involved in this first phase of the business growth process. So let's talk about the importance of building, and I put in there in all caps, a good prospect customer list. Now it's, when I talk about a good prospect list, I want to talk about, when I say that, I mean, it's a list that has mostly customers prospective customers that you want to do business with. It's a clean list. It's well thought out, all of those things that I'll talk about in just a minute. But a few things that it's important to have a customer list and have a good one is it keeps you focused. So you're spending time on the right prospects. And we go at France Building Services, we went to great lengths to put only prospects in our system that we wanted to do business with. And so that's an important part of this and why it's important to have a good customer list. The next, it saves time and energy. You're just not chasing around a bunch of prospects that really are not the kind that you want to have or you want to serve in your company long term. This is a really important part is it builds a steady pipeline, and this takes time, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, but it's important to shove a bunch of, if you will, a bunch of good prospects into your sales pipeline or your sales funnel because our sales cycle is so long in this business, or can be so long in this business. So it's important that we have really great flow in the pipeline. When I got to France, our pipeline was really empty. So it took me several months really to kind of get ramped up, to fill the pipeline, to start the pipeline flowing. So it's important to do that. The next thing there is it helps us to say the right things. And so when we've got a good database and we've got the right fields, properties or fields, so that we can segment our data, then we can say the right things to, like, for instance, we want to call when we're calling on medical practices, we want to talk about what we do as housekeeping, or when we call on commercial buildings, we want to talk about it as cleaning, or schools, it'd be custodial. So it really helps us segment our data so as we say the right things. And then the last thing, and it's really important as well, is it makes forecasting easier. Once you get your data, once you start this list building, this research that goes into it, it'll give you a better handle on a couple of things. And most notably, do you have enough qualified prospects in your market area to sustain your business? And so this is another piece that's just super helpful. So I can't say this enough. You got to have a list, and you got to have a really good list. All right, so let's talk about building that list. So the first thing that I mentioned right there is there's no silver bullet to this. List building is hard. It just takes time. And even if you purchase, and we'll talk about one of these list purchases, even if you purchase a list or you use a service, there's still some massaging and cleaning of your list that takes place. So don't take this step lightly. Have a good process for this. All of this is just, it has to be well thought out. And it's kind of some heavy lifting here. I would encourage you to consider using both a combination of list purchase and organic list building. Using both of these is probably the best approach to take. And it's the approach that we've taken at France Building Services, and it's served us pretty well. So let's talk about building a list by purchasing a list. Typically it costs money. So you're going to have whatever system you use or source that you use, something like ZoomInfo. It costs money, and it's not inexpensive, but it's a way to gather the data much faster than the organic research that I'll talk about in just a minute. And I would say the data accuracy is average to better than average. And there's a variety of reasons why I say that. I won't get into them now, but if the point here is if you think getting a subscription to ZoomInfo is going to magically get you a bunch of prospective customer names and the data is going to be really, really, really accurate, I think we're kind of fooling ourselves. But if you want data that's, let's call it 70% accurate, then I think these things can help. And I've just got a few on there that I have either done a free trial with or used. We use ZoomInfo at France Building Services now. However, for the first 6 years that I was at France, we built our list doing only organic research. But now we've got ZoomInfo and use that. We also use LinkedIn Sales Navigator. LinkedIn Sales Navigator, I think, is around $80 a month. It's a good investment. There's good information out there. It's really helpful for finding contacts, but that's list purchase, and that's using what's out on the internet that you can pay for to help build your list. The next one is then the other way to build a list is organic list building. And this also costs money because you have to pay somebody to do it. So at France Building Services, part of my role initially was, or a big part of my role was to help build out our list. And at a certain point, when our pipeline began to get was more full and we were getting opportunities, I brought in another person part-time to help me, mostly to do prospect research. And so it's going to cost money. It's slower, but I can tell you, I've seen two different kinds of lists, and our data accuracy in our list is much higher. We have good information on the companies. It's very accurate, and then we spend the time to find the right contacts. And so again, I've got, and I'll show you in just a minute, a tool that's really helpful. It's been helpful to a lot of people in our Elite BSC group as they're going down this path with organic list building, is our research tool or research guide. I'll show you that in just a minute, and I'll make that available to you if you just email me at the email I'll show you at the end. Google Maps, free tool, very, very helpful to help you. Once you've researched and found a company name or an organization name, you can actually look it up on the map and see if that building is actually there. Sometimes we'll research and we'll find that a building's been torn down, and that's obviously not a good customer. But you can also look and say, hey, how big is the parking lot? So you can see, if it's a building and it's got a big parking lot, they probably got a lot of employees that work there. It's probably going to be a good prospect. And then also, if needed, you can also use Google Maps to measure the buildings if you want to gather that data and make that a part of your data in your database. The last thing down there at the bottom is just I would call it almost free. It's an email finder. I'm not sure exactly how to say that first word, but I think it's Voila Norbert. And it's a really nice little site. It's not, again, it's not 100% accurate. But if you know a person's name and you know their domain of where they work, you can put that information in there. And I would call it 7 times out of 10, it will give you the right email address. And so, again, I would, if I were starting out on a limited budget, I would purchase LinkedIn Sales Navigator, and then I would use our organic research tool and that email finder, and that's where I'd get started. Another approach would be to get a 1-year subscription to ZoomInfo and spend a lot of time building your list initially and getting that information in there. And then at the end of the year, you can drop that subscription. But anyway, I think ZoomInfo might be between, I'll call it $900 and $1,200 a month. So it's a little bit of an investment, but it speeds up the list building process. Here's our organic research guide. And there's multiple pages to this. And I built this because I used it as a tool to help anybody that came in our company and particularly this lady that we brought in on our team, to help her kind of speed her up on the process of doing prospect research. And so what you've got in the first column is whatever the segment or vertical that you're looking for. So let's take, for instance, let's look at the very first one is churches or places of worship. The second column says it's where you can locate prospects. And so these are just internet searches, and they're all free. And so, for instance, you can look under churchfinder.com, and you could say, and when it pulls it up, if you're looking in Nashville, Tennessee, you could put Nashville, and it's going to locate all the churches. In our case, at France Building Services, we only wanted to find large churches. And so there's you can see the second one is Hartford Institute for Religion Research. It's mega churches. That was helpful to us. But all of these are free not free really, tools are free internet searches that you can locate these prospects. The next column then is where you can find contacts. So in a church's case, really easy to find the contacts there because they typically have their picture on their website. You know, church is going to want you to see their staff. Those pictures are there. Typically, the person who you want to contact, their pictures on there with their title and an email address. It's really easy to find some of these contacts once you get into the locations. And then lastly, the last column is if you're researching, say, in LinkedIn Sales Navigator or maybe even in ZoomInfo, there's the roles of the people that are typically part of the decision-making process for janitorial or cleaning services. So again, this is, I don't know, it's probably a 3-page document with all the segments and then all the places that we have found prospects. Here's a few list building best practices. The first thing that I would encourage you to do is to establish a research process. And I know it sounds maybe sounds a little goofy, but here's what I mean by that. Like, for instance, here, if we were starting out at France, one of the things that we might do is we would say, hey, let's find all of the prospects in Warren County, Kentucky, but let's find them in this order. Let's find all the manufacturing facilities in Warren County, and let's get those finished. And then let's find all the private schools, and we'll get those finished. And let's find all the outpatient clinics. You get the idea. So that's really looking at one particular area and then systematically moving through each one of the segments. The other one, it might be, is that you say, hey, first I want to kind of niche down on something like manufacturing facilities. And so at France, we served, I don't know, probably 60 or 70 counties in Kentucky and Indiana and Tennessee. And so what we could have done is said, hey, let's just first find all of the manufacturing facilities and get those in there. And then let's go back and let's look in all the counties and let's find the private schools. So just whatever the case might be, is just to have a process for that. Secondly, is decide on the minimum necessary information and gather only that. I think one of the things I see too often, and I think probably the reason for this is that you buy a CRM that I'll talk about in just a minute, and there's literally hundreds of fields that are available to you, and you feel like in your team, you or your team feel like you need to put some data in all those fields. I would encourage you as you build your list is to say, hey, what is just a minimum amount of information that I need to send an email or make a telephone call to these people that are in these companies? And so you can see right there. So company, you want name, you want physical address. That's important. So whenever you go out to visit them to do a facility tour, you got that. And you have the physical address of the location and not their headquarters. I find that a lot too. When I look at people's databases, they may be serving, Fayetteville, North Carolina, and they're trying to research, they're trying to call on somebody that's in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and their headquarters is in Texas, and they have that information in there. And that information might be helpful to have in the database because that's where the decision maker might lie. But it's important to have the physical address of the actual location you're going to serve, telephone number, website, and then building users. I think that's important if you can get that. We built our database at France Building Services by trying to get that information. And in some cases, we estimated that. Building users are employees. It could be, I'll talk about that in just a minute, but that's building users. And then for contacts, same thing, name, title, telephone number, and email. That's all you need. Now you can add to this, like for instance, in contacts, as you're moving along and you're starting to call on people and you might look up their LinkedIn profile. That might be something good to put in the database, but not in the initial list building. Thirdly is to have a CRM in place. I think that's important. I've listed a few there. We use HubSpot. We used to use Salesforce, Pipedrive, and Zoho, or a couple of others that I hear. A lot of these have very, very inexpensive versions of their program. For instance, HubSpot will let you get started for free. And that'll take you a little ways. Most of the time you end up having to go with, most of the people that I work with end up getting the starter version, which is probably around probably in between $75 and $100 a month. And that's a pretty robust program for $100 a month. So anyway, have a CRM in place. And I'll talk about some custom fields in just a minute. The next step, and it seems minor, but it's important, is to decide upon the naming conventions of companies with multiple locations. So for instance, there's a customer of ours at France is Graves Gilbert Medical Clinic, and they're headquartered in Bowling Green. And so when you're inputting information into your system, it's important to have some kind of a naming convention so that when the data goes in, it's clean. It's everybody's putting it in the same way. And so you might even create a little document for your team or for yourself to make sure that you're inputting information in a consistent manner. And then lastly, as you're building your list, so you're building a list of companies and associated contacts, I would encourage you to try to get at least 2 contacts per company or organization and no more than 5 contacts. And so, for instance, if I'm calling on an outpatient medical practice, if it's a big practice, I might try to get the facilities manager and the practice manager. If it's a little bit smaller facility, outpatient facility, I might only get the medical practice administrator because that might be the only person in the office that's going to make a decision on the janitorial services. Okay, let's talk about organizing the data. So we've bought a CRM. We're starting to research that information. I'm going to recommend how to set up your database with some custom fields here. And one of the things that we do at Elite BSC, and I've done several of these now, is not only kind of direct people in building their list, but I'll help them set up their database with some of these custom fields. So on your company record, and I'll show you France Building Services database in just a second. On the company record, we want those base fields that I just talked about, but then we want to build in these custom fields. So the first custom field you see is segment. And there's some segments that we use at France Building Services. There's probably in our database, we probably got about a dozen segments that we can use. It's in a drop-down menu, and that's important too, is to set up drop-down menus for your team so that they're not misspelling manufacturing or misspelling governmental. You just drop down, have a drop-down list to select the segment. Building users, I've mentioned that just a minute ago. That would be employees in a manufacturing facility, for instance. It'd be providers in a medical practice, students in a school. You get the idea. Here's another field that I think is important to put in is decision maker identified. So again, we're selling to companies, we're selling to contacts that are in companies, but in my eyes, the company is really our customer, because the people might come and go, but the company remains. And so and I'll talk about this next week, as we're making outbound telephone calls and emails, our initial approach to customers is really, or prospects, is really trying to find, are you the decision maker, and where are you in your purchase readiness? So we're going to want to put decision maker identified. That's a yes or no checkbox. We also want to know if they outsource the work. And so that's another question that we'll ask, and I'll talk about next week, is, do you outsource the work? We want to know yes or no. And then lastly, we want to have the company prospect status. And I'll talk about this in just a second. And our prospect statuses are pre-qualified, cold, warm, hot customer. So we want to identify people in our database that are current customers, because we don't want to do any initial contact outreach to those. We want to know if we former customers of ours, unqualified prospects, and then other prospects. And that'll make more sense in just a minute. That's the company record. On the contact record, we want the base fields. And then there's really only one other custom field that I would recommend when you're getting started, and that's just the decision maker question. So it's either yes, no. So for instance, let's say that we've got Bob Smith. He's the facilities manager. We've reached out to him. He says, hey, yeah, I'm the one who's primarily responsible for selecting the janitorial vendor. We want to have a check mark on there, because we might have 2 or 3 other contacts that are in there. And so we want to make sure that we know that he is the decision maker. So that's organizing your data in the database. So this is what it looks like. And I've blacked out the names here. But this is what our database looks like. Again, we use HubSpot. So what's over on the left side in this particular case is all the company information. You can see the company name, telephone number, street address, city, state. We actually look at things on a county basis too. And then we have their website, and that's all we have. We didn't gather any other information in our initial approach to this. Now we've got a few more fields now, because we're trying to project, based on the number of people that are in their buildings. We've got a little formula that runs in the background that says, hey, based on these criteria, we anticipate that this particular prospect is going to yield $20,000 a month in monthly recurring revenue. But that's kind of a next step to develop that. But that's the basic information there. On the right-hand side is the contact information. I could blow that up and you could see that. And in the middle is all of our activities. And so this is why I'm not pitching HubSpot, but this is why I like it, is that all of the information about the customer is right here. And if I were to click on the contact information would flip over to the left, and it would show over here on the right. It would show just the company that they're associated with, but all that information is linked. So let's talk about those prospect statuses real quick. And again, I think this is important, and this is something that most people that I encounter don't have a system for this. And I don't think it's that complicated, but I think, again, it's just that granular information that people need. So we've got we'll call it a funnel, because this is more of a funnel, but you can turn it up on its side and it could be a pipeline. And so these are the statuses that we use and have used at France. And it's made a lot of sense for us internally to say, hey, I'm trying to find prospects that are in, I'm just going to pick a city, Bowling Green, Kentucky, or Warren County, Kentucky. And when I put them in the system, when I put them in the top of the funnel, I'm going to call them pre-qualified. And so just what it says there, a pre-qualified prospect is one that appears to meet our ideal customer profile, but we just have not completed our initial connection or our discovery process. So what that means is when I get into the database, or when our sales team or our business development team gets into the database, and their goal for the day is to make some initial outreach, we can sort our data and say, show me only the pre-qualified prospects in Warren County, Kentucky, so that we're calling on those and we're trying to make that initial discovery call. So those are pre-qualified prospects. The next one are what we call MQL, but they could be cold prospects. And a cold prospect is one where we've completed the initial outreach. We've confirmed that we have the decision maker. And what they've said to us is, hey, I'm happy with my current vendor, or I do it with an in-house team, and I'm not really interested in making a change. I'm pretty happy with who we're with. We identify those as either cold or marketing qualified leads, or MQL. But again, it's a prospect status. And here's what's important. if I'm calling out a manufacturing facility that has 1,000 employees, if that person tells me that they're happy with their current vendor and they'll likely never change, that doesn't diminish the fact that they're still a really good prospect. I really want to do business with them, but they're just not. If you think about the buyer's journey, they're unaware of any problems, and they're at that they're not making any moves. But I want to know that because I want to nurture them through the process. And again, I'll talk about that next week. Uh, but having a category or a status is important. Next status is what we call SQL, sales qualified lead, or warm. And this is where we've reached out, we've made initial connection, we've confirmed the decision maker. And what they've said is I'm not in the market right now, but I will be in the market in the future. So it looks like this. Hey, we just signed a 2-year contract. That'll come up for renewal and at the not this December, but next December. Reach out to me before then. That's important information for me. So I mark them as a sales qualified lead or an SQL or warm. And then I put a date in there, a task to contact that particular prospect 3 or 4 months in advance of the termination of that contract so that I can get on their bidders list, so that I can participate in their vendor selection process. And then lastly is, we call it an opportunity or a hot prospect. That's when someone says, hey, yeah, let's come on out to our building, walk through our facility, gather information, and provide a proposal. And so this is someone that is actively engaged with us in asking for a proposal. Now, I won't get into too much detail, but I've also, once someone has attained prospect status of opportunity or hot, I've also got a deal pipeline where I'm working on a particular deal with them until that's finished. So again, that prospect statuses are important to have to organize your database really well. And this is how those things align. And so I mentioned this last week, the buyer's journey. And so you can see pre-qualified, we don't even know where they are on their buyer's journey. That's why we call them pre-qualified. They look like a prospect because we've done our prospect research. We just haven't made that initial outreach yet. But once we've made the initial outreach, we know where they are on their buyer's journey. So like I just mentioned, if someone says, hey, we're happy with our current vendor, or they say something like, well, our current vendor's been kind of stumbling a little bit right now, but I'm really not ready to make a change. I'm probably just going to go talk to them and kind of see where they are and see if we can get this problem fixed. So all of this, it's just a way to identify and match our statuses with where a prospect is on their buyer's journey. All right, so let me mention this, and I've got a couple other things I want to share. One of the things that I see folks doing often or asking about is saying, hey, I'm going to hire a salesperson and that's going to help us grow. And I don't, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you hire a salesperson that doesn't like to do prospect research and doesn't like to make initial outreach calls, then that person's probably not going to be successful and or happy in their role. One suggestion that I would make, if I'm talking to companies who are just kind of getting this thing started, getting the ball rolling, or trying to get something, kind of a process in place, is I might hire a sales development rep. That's a person who works in your office primarily, if not solely works in your office. And they've got 2 roles. Their first role is to fill up that database using good research technique that we've talked about already. And then the second part that they will do is they'll be a person who will make that initial outreach to customers, either through a telephone call or through an email or through a combination or through a LinkedIn message. But what their role will be is to identify where that particular prospective customer is on their buyer's journey. And sometimes they'll identify somebody that says, hey, yeah, I'm ready to make a decision, or we're in the decision-making process, or we're just getting ready to start in the decision-making process. And then what you can do, this person can then hand that off to somebody else in the company. So maybe if you're the owner watching this, they might hand it off to you, or they may hand it off to one of your senior operations people who can go out and do a facility walkthrough and come back and develop that proposal. So that's an important thing to think about in this process as well. Last thing here is, sometimes I get this, that people will say to me, I have a list, or I have pulled together lists from different places. I bought a list. I got lists from, just various things, and it's all crammed together and the data's not good. And we run into this a decent amount as we're helping people get started with their business development process. I think the first thing that not the first, I don't think, the first thing I do is I'll say, hey, is there any way that we can identify some criteria to say that's a target, that's a prospect, or that's a group of prospects that I want to go after. So you create a field. If all of your information is in an Excel spreadsheet, which is all right, is just create a column called target and go down through the list, and anything that's a target, just mark it as yes, or put an X in there so you can sort the list. But in this way, at least you can take that kind of unwieldy list and say, hey, I want to, out of these 3,000 people in here, I want to narrow this down to the 100 people or 100 companies that I want to reach out to. So that would be something that I would do, is create that target field and then have some criteria based, either that's location or type of business, and begin to focus your energy on a fewer prospects versus the 3,000. I just see that a lot, and that's like, I got 3,000 names. I mean, where do I even get started? And so this little tip might help you with that. And the other thing I would do is just go in and kind of clean up naming conventions. Go back and put in there, some of those things that I talked about, like, the name of the company, and then, if it's a multiple location, the site. So oftentimes too, I see abbreviations in names, even things that come out of lists. And that's confusing. We serve a bank up here called US Bank. But if something is in there in the database that says USB, I don't really know what that is. So it's important to take those abbreviations out and get good names in there in your list. And that's one way to kind of start cleaning up what I call a messy list. So I think that's all I've got. I hope this information is helpful. I want it to be practical. I want this to be information that you can use to start this process and start researching and getting some information, get a list built and put into a database. We do this a lot with our Elite BSC group. This is the kinds of things that we work on together. We help our member companies do these things. Our member companies help us with, they do things different than what we did at France, and so we're learning together. And so again, I'll make a little quick pitch. If you'd like to join, or you'd like to learn about joining Elite BSC, I'd love to have a Zoom call with you and tell you a little bit about what the group is and what we provide and how I think we can help. I'd be glad to have that conversation with you. It would not be a sales call. It would just be us chatting about what we provide, and me just learning a little bit about your company. So again, I hope this information is helpful. In a couple of weeks, I'll have part 3 where I'll talk about how to make those initial outreach telephone calls and emails, and that whole cadence, and then the cadence for and how to nurture prospects, taking them from a prospect all the way down to having the opportunity to propose for their business. So again, I hope this was helpful. And if you need anything, you've got my contact information. Please feel free to reach out. I hope you have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.